بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق والأصدق القائلين: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. وقال الملك ائتوني به فلما جاءه الرسول قال ارجع إلى ربك فاسأله ما بال النسوة اللاتي قطعن أيديهن إن ربي بكيدهن عليم. قال ما خطبكن إذ راودتن يوسف عن نفسه قلنا حاشا لله ما علمنا عليه من سوء. قالت امرأة العزيز الآن حسحس الحق أنا راودته عن نفسه وإنه لمن الصادقين. آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. In a hadith from Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, he says, عجبت لأمر المؤمن كله خير. He says, I am amazed at the affairs of the believer. Everything that ends up happening to them is good. At the end of the day, sometimes we don't see goodness in the moment that we're in the trial or the tribulation that we're at any particular given moment. But beyond what we see apparent to the eye, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is visible. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is present. And that God Himself, He, in His realm and in that world of the unseen, is facilitating for our growth and for our benefit, particularly for those who are believers. Sometimes we don't know why it is that we're going through a particular trial or tribulation. Sometimes we don't know exactly why this particular, financial stress, relationship stress, we're struggling at work or whatever it is. We don't know why that's happening at this given moment. But God, He wants to cultivate us, and He wants for us to be able to receive what it is that we're going to receive at the best of times. Because again, this is a God that cares about His creation, and that He wants our success. And we see this consistently in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, that through his patience and through his perseverance, in spite of all of the odds and everything that he has to go through, that eventually God will put him out of the difficulties that he's in. But it requires for him to go through all of those ups and downs and many downs during the course of his life before the materialization of his ultimate, reward in this dunya. And of course in the akhirah as well. And we see this where we stopped last week, that Yusuf alayhi salam had these two companions of his in the prison who were eventually freed, and Yusuf alayhi salam lives for 7 years in prison with the difficulty, the trials that he had to deal with. We don't even know half of them because we're only given a little bit of a glimpse into what it is that he experienced in that prison. And finally, one of those companions of his who were in the prison with him, who was working now for the king tells his ministers and every one of his employees, he says that I had this really, really weird dream. Can any of you interpret it for me? We talked about that last week. And they respond to him, قالوا أضغاث أحلام. This dream, oh our king, doesn't make any sense. وما نحن بتأويل الأحلام بعالمين. We have no idea what dreams mean. And at that moment, that same member, that same inmate who was with Yusuf alayhi salam, who asked for his dream to be interpreted some years earlier, he remembers and he says, wait a minute, I could gain a lot of favor from the king if I am able to interpret his dream, or I'm able to get an answer to this question. And so, though Yusuf alayhi salam tells him as he was about to leave prison years earlier, hey, remember to mention my name to the king so I can be freed from this prison, what happens? He forgets. But at this moment he remembers that at the end of the day, Yusuf alayhi salam, he's still in that prison and he has this ability to interpret dreams. So he quickly tells the king, وَقَالَ الَّذِي نَجَى مِنْهُمَا وَادَّكَرَ بَعْدَ أُمَّةٍ أَنَا أُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِتَأْوِيلِهِ فَأَرْسِلُونَ. He says, wait a minute. O king, everyone is telling you that this dream that you had doesn't make any sense. He says, I will be able to find you the interpretation to this dream. But give me a moment. I need to just step away for a second. Meaning, I need to go and ask Yusuf what this dream means. So he goes to Yusuf alayhi salam. He asks Yusuf to explain and to give a commentary of that dream. And the commentary is such that the community, this king, has to be responsible for his, for Egypt in its entirety, that is going to, undergo a serious drought, and to preserve as much as grains and crops as possible, so that after, when the drought does take place, that people are not, in the state of, at the brink of poverty and hunger and thirst. So at this moment, he returns back, this inmate, he returns back to the king, and this is where we left off last week, and he tells him the interpretation of the dream. He says that, I spoke with somebody in prison, and he knows, what this dream of yours means. And where we stopped off last week is verse number 50. وَقَالَ الْمَلِكُ ائْتُونِي بِهِ. He says, the king tells him, he says, bring him to me. Bring this inmate who has the ability to interpret dreams to me. فَلَمَّا جَاءَهُ الرَّسُولُ قَالَ ارْجِعْ إِلَى رَبِّكَ فَاسْأَلْهُ مَا بَالُ النِّسْوَةِ اللَّاتِي قَطَعْنَ أَيْدِيَهُنَّ إِنَّ رَبِّي بِكَيْدِهِنَّ عَلِيمٌ. So it is said that the messenger, he goes to Yusuf alayhi salam, who's in prison, and he says that the king is going to free you from prison. You need to come to him, and he wants to, pick your brain. He wants to talk to you about how you got this ability to interpret dreams. He wants you to give him a detailed answer with regards to, this drought that our community is going to ensue. But before he says, okay, no worries, no problem, I'll come with you, let's go right now, right? He has the opportunity to be freed from prison at that moment. He doesn't say, sure, I'll come with you. He says, no. He says, I won't come. First, go back to him and tell him, why did those women cut their fingers when they saw me? Meaning, in other words, he wants to prove his innocence before he exits this prison. He wants to make sure that he's leaving on his own terms. Not because the king wants him, but he also wants to make sure that he is absolved of any, sin in the kingdom of the government. This is number one. The second thing, which is far more important, at least which caught my attention when you recite this verse, if you take a look at the Arabic, I don't know how it's translated, but it says, وَقَالَ الْمَلِكُ ائْتُونِي بِهِ فَلَمَّا جَاءَهُ الرَّسُولُ قَالَ ارْجِعْ إِلَى رَبِّكَ فَاسْأَلْهُ مَا بَالُ النِّسْوَةِ اللَّاتِي قَطَعْنَ أَيْدِيَهُنَّ. He tells the messenger, he says, go back to your Rabb, go back to your Lord. Because they were subservient to this king. So he says, go back to your Lord and ask him, why did the women cut off their fingers? And then at the end of the verse, he states, Inna Rabbi bikaydihinna alim. My Lord, he knows the truth. You get what I'm saying? In other words, he's trying to teach this guy a lesson as well. Remember, we talked about this earlier. Every opportunity that Yusuf alayhi salam had to remind others about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he would do just that. And over here, he makes it very, very clear. He said, that's the man that you're worshipping, but my Lord, he knows the truth. He knows how they deceived me and put me in this position that I'm in right now. Last week, I think Qasim was not here. He asked, why is this word, Rabb attributed to the king? And we mentioned because they were in the state of subservience to this. But over here, Yusuf alayhi salam puts a play on it as he's explaining to his, as he's explaining to this messenger. And one other quick point that sort of comes from this verse that a lot of people many times are a bit confused about. When we talk about Zulaykha, this woman who sought to seduce Yusuf alayhi salam, many people, they get the sort of perception that she was the wife of the king. She was the wife of the Malik. But that's not the case. She was likely the wife of, the equivalent of the second in charge, of the kingdom, or who was known as Aziz, as is mentioned within the Quran. So there's a differentiation between these two people. Follow what I'm saying? So this king who's requesting the presence of Yusuf alayhi salam, it's not his wife that we're talking about. Yeah. So Yusuf alayhi salam, he tells this messenger, he says, go back to your king and tell him, let him ask the women, why is it that they cut off their fingers when they saw me? Inna Rabbi bikaydihinna alim. Surely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, my Lord, knows the truth. So it is said, according to different reports and some of our ahadith, it is said that he said, no problem. I will ask. And so he asks the women, he asks Zulaykha herself, who are all in the company of the king, and this is mentioned within verse 51 of the Holy Quran. قال ما خطبكن إذ راودتن يوسف عن نفسه قلنا حاشا لله ما علمنا عليه من سوء قالت امرأة العزيز الآن حسحس الحق أنا راودته عن نفسه وإنه لمن الصادقين. This is mentioned in verse number 51. So he gathers together all of these women who were working in, the, White House, so to say, of the time. And he says, what was the situation with Yusuf? Like, what is he talking about? To which, at this moment, she, Zulaykha, the prince's wife, she steps up and she says, now the truth has come. At the end of the day, we don't know anything bad about Yusuf alayhi salam. He was perfect. It was us. It was me. I was responsible for this whole thing. She admits her fault at this moment. So over here, it is said that Yusuf alayhi salam now has been, all of those, take one step back, Yusuf alayhi salam at this moment has been freed, not only from prison, but also from these perceptions of the king and the authorities at this time. ذلك ليعلم أني لم أخنه بالغيب وأن الله لا يهدي كيد الخائنين. And over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in verse number 52, he says, quoting Yusuf alayhi salam, he says, over here, I want to demonstrate again that I was in the right, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always allow for those who tell the truth to be victorious, in other words, and those who are deceptive to be understood, meaning also to be exposed. Over here, it is said that according to hadith that Yusuf alayhi salam is brought out of prison and he's presented in front of the king. And he stands in front of him and he says, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. But the king doesn't speak the Arabic language. So he says, what are you saying? He says, this is the language of my grandfather, Ismail. So then at this moment, he greets him in Hebrew. He greets the king in Hebrew. So at this moment, the king says, I don't understand what you're saying. What language are you speaking? He's trying to demonstrate how intelligent he is. And he's also trying to demonstrate, right, that he has this divine gift. So he says, this is the language of my father, Yaqub, whose father is Ishaq, the son of Ibrahim alayhi salam. In other words, he's trying to demonstrate that I come from the lineage of prophets. I come from the lineage of these incredible figures who you may have heard of. And the king is really, really impressed. He's impressed with Yusuf alayhi salam. We talked about this, and just to sort of stress this point for just one moment. Consistently from the beginning of the story, from the beginning of the chapter until the very end, there are all of these small glimpses where people are very amazed by the presence of Yusuf alayhi salam, right? So we talk about from the very beginning. The brothers, they recognize that there's something a little bit unique about him. Even Yaqub, we mentioned in the very beginning, as a deduction from many of our hadith, that even he sees something very special about Yusuf alayhi salam and his piety and so on. Later on, we see that the women, they say that he's an angel, he's not a human being. Later on, the inmates, they see Yusuf alayhi salam, and what do they say? They call him from the muhsineen. They haven't spoken to him. They don't know anything about him. but they know that he's a good person just on the basis of his presence. So similarly, the king now sees Yusuf alayhi salam. And imagine how many other people he sees, how many other people he seeks to building relationships with, how many people he's in communication with on a day-to-day basis. He's the head of state of this massive empire. Yet he sees something so unique in one of his former prisoners, Yusuf alayhi salam, at this moment. So over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or excuse me, the king, he sees this sort of unique station from Yusuf alayhi salam, and the way that he speaks to him with some sense of courage. Normally, back in the day, even till today, when someone speaks in the presence of authority, they humble themselves, they speak really, really carefully. They're not going to speak in a language that the authority doesn't understand, right? Over here, Yusuf alayhi salam is saying, I'm not concerned about your kingdom, nor of your authority, nor of how much power that you have. I'm going to be me, because I have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to back me up. So over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues in verse 53. وَمَا أُبْرِئُ نَفْسِي إِنَّ النَّفْسَ لَأَمَّارَةٌ بِالسُّوءِ إِلَّا مَا رَحِمَ رَبِّي إِنَّ رَبِّي غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ وَقَالَ الْمَلِكُ ائْتُونِي بِهِ أَسْتَخْلِصْهُ لِنَفْسِي فَلَمَّا كَلَّمَهُ قَالَ إِنَّكَ الْيَوْمَ لَدَيْنَا مَكِينٌ أَمِينٌ. So verses 52 and 53, Yusuf alayhi salam is virtually speaking to himself. What would we get from our commentary and from the ahadith? Whereby Yusuf alayhi salam, he knows that this conversation is taking place externally, right? The king has gathered together all of his women, all of the ministers of his court. Yusuf alayhi salam knows that this is going to be the moment of truth for me. This is the moment where I'm going to get absolved from the sin that they've attributed me to, and I'm going to be released from this prison. So he states in verse number 53, he says, "Yet I do not absolve my own soul, for surely this soul of mine," meaning in other words, he's trying to say, a lot of people sort of misinterpret this verse, where Yusuf alayhi salam is telling this messenger as he's leaving to go back to the king and saying, hey, why don't you go and ask the king to ask the women about what it is that they did to put me in this position. Now Yusuf alayhi salam is speaking to himself. He says that this soul of ours can do wonders of evil. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us with a spiritual dimension, this soul of ours. And part of this soul is that soul which compels the human being to evil. Nafsul ammarata bis-su'. Sometimes we have the opportunity to commit sin because it's so close to us, it's so tangible in front of us, and we're very quick to jump to it. That's because our soul is not cultivated in a way whereby we feel any guilt before we end up in, that sin. You take a look at a child, for instance. Have you ever seen a child lie before? What happens when a child is lying? Anybody?
Really terrible liars.
They're really terrible liars, right? Why?
Because I don't know. It's like they have no they're trying to appeal to you in some way to get what they want, but
But you know that they're lying, right? How can we get a lot better at it as we grow up? Because we have that much more practice, right? Because a child, when they're lying, they feel guilt. And they know that they're not saying the truth. When my children are lying to me, whether or not they brush their teeth or not, their face becomes red, they start smiling. It's so evident and obvious that they haven't brushed their teeth yet. But as they get a little bit older, and as we get a little bit older, we're so accustomed to lying that no longer are we, sometimes we even make ourselves believe, that, we're not lying. And imagine just how, imagine just how dangerous that is. One sin plus one sin plus one sin, all of them, they continue to add up until there's no sense of guilt. There's no concern anymore. There's no care. No issue with it. We're totally content with being in that position. But when we're young, the first time we lie, we can remember just how embarrassed we felt about the situation at that time. This is what is known as nafsul ammarata bis-su'. Sometimes that sin looks so large to us. It looks like it's something that, oh my God, this is so horrific. And if we end up engaging in that sin in this life, we were to utilize that as the example, I'm not going to be able to function properly. You can't sleep at night. I can't believe I lied to my mom, to my dad, to my sibling, to my friend, to my coworker, whatever, And then it just becomes a part and intrinsic to who we are. Compound sort of, interest, so to say, for you folks in the banking finance world, right? That it just becomes so connected and linked to who you are intrinsically that you don't know how to get out of it. Over here, we have to take a look at ourselves when we are justifying our behaviors and our sins as they're compounding in that same way. And so over here, Yusuf alayhi salam is saying that he's talking to himself, saying that if it were not for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I could have fallen into that trap. Illa ma rahima rabbi. That from the mercy and from the grace of my Lord, reminding us, but at the same time reminding himself that it could have been any moment that I could have slipped to the seduction of this woman. But I stopped myself by the grace and by the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Over here, again, that lesson is for us. That this soul is consistently compelling us to evil. But if we see ourselves consistently falling to it without allowing for us to feel guilt, us, self-talking and saying, wait a minute, this is not what I should be doing. This is not like what a believer should be up to. I need to be careful about my actions, about my behaviors, about my words that I speak, about the thoughts that enter into my mind, whatever it might be. Then at the end of the day, I'm eventually going to fall in. So it's all about fighting this battle. That's what is known as jihadun nafs that we often speak to consistently push back, fight back.
I don't know, maybe my translation is just off. Is Yusuf speaking to himself in 52 and 53?
According to some, most commentators of the Quran,
this one, I think it starts with Zulaykha's quote, and then they don't end Zulaykha's quote until the end of verse 53.
Until the end of?
53.
So they're saying that 51, 52, 53 is Zulaykha's quote. Yeah. Wallahu alam. Yours too? Wallahu alam. Either way, we can take benefit from it.
But if it is Zulaykha speaking, then at this point, is she expressing
regret? Regret, maybe.
But also, before, it seemed like she was worshiping the idols.
Yeah.
And now she's speaking about Rabbul Alamin.
Well, if you take a look at verse number 52, وَذَلِكَ لِيَعْلَمْ أَنِّي لَمْ أَخُنْهُ بِالْغَيْبِ وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَهْدِي كَيْدَ الْخَائِنِينَ. She's mentioning even Allah's name, right? So that would be if she were the one who's speaking in this.
When I first read it, I thought it was Zulaykha speaking too, and I was thinking about how in the Quran, it's not very common for us to see someone go from pure evil to repentance and turning away, turning towards Allah, and it kind of humanizes her
a little bit, yeah.
Can kind of be inspiration for us that someone who can be so wrong and so sinful that she tries to seduce the Prophet of God, there's still room for. There's always room to turn around.
Yeah, beautiful. See, there's a lot of this in Surah Yusuf. We mentioned, I think, a couple of weeks ago as well, that who is the one who forgot, right? These inmates. Was it Yusuf alayhi salam who forgot Allah, right? Many would say, why did he ask the inmate to go and intercede for him to the king? While others would say, no, it is the inmate himself who forgot, right? So there's these sort of subtleties in the Quran that, at the end of the day, we don't know. But either way, we can sort of deduce some benefit from these ayats. Perfect, thank you. So now going back to verse number 54. وقال الملك ائتوني به أستخلصه لنفسي فلما كلمه قال إنك اليوم لدينا مكين أمين. Okay. So verse number 54. So now Yusuf alayhi salam is brought. And now over here, this is the moment now where the king, he sees this sort of unique, quality, this unique charisma coming from Yusuf alayhi salam. And then he states, after he sees him, he states, "Astakhlishu li nafsi." He says, this young man, with his charisma, the way that he speaks, there's something about him. I am appointing him to me. He doesn't work for anyone. He only works for me because I see something unique about him. Okay. So then he continues. And then he says, the king said, bring him to me, after he speaks to Yusuf alayhi salam, after he converses with him, after Yusuf interprets the dream in all of its detail. In fact, the hadith says that he brings, he tells Yusuf, he says, Yusuf, I hear you have the ability to interpret dreams, and I got some information from, like one of my ministers. He says, why don't you interpret the dream for me, but let me tell you what I saw. So Yusuf says, no. You don't tell me what you saw. Let me explain to you what you saw. Meaning, I know more about your dream than you know about me. In other words, don't worry about that. I have that knowledge. Again, he's trying to demonstrate his authority over the king even. But the king, he sees it as something very attractive. So after he had spoken to him, he tells him, he says, from today onwards, O Yusuf, you will be honored and you are seen as someone who's close and trustworthy to me. You follow? So after everything now that Yusuf alayhi salam has gone through, these are like the turning moments of his life. In verse number 55, قَالَ اجْعَلْنِي عَلَى خَزَائِنِ الْأَرْضِ إِنِّي حَفِيظٌ عَلِيمٌ. So he tells him, he says, oh Yusuf, he says, so we're going to undergo this massive famine and drought and so on and so forth. What should I do? What should we do? How do I know how much to preserve, what to preserve? He said, I don't have the knowledge of that, the king is saying. He said, we should appoint like a committee, a council of, governors, of ministers, of people in the government who can take care of the grains and the fruits and the vegetables and the crops and whatever, to make sure that we're equitably, distributing all of this to the people and whatever. And Yusuf alayhi salam says, no, we don't need anybody. Why? He says, اجعلني على خزائن الأرض إني حفيظ عليم. He says, don't worry. He says, make me that person. Make me responsible for all of the wealth in your kingdom. I got this. He says, because if you're looking for someone who is trustworthy, I am trustworthy. If you're looking for someone who's knowledgeable about the affairs of this dunya and about fruits and vegetables and crops and government and all of the sciences of this world, then I'm that person. Inni hafidun alim. I got this. وَكَذَلِكَ, in verse number 56, which I said is the most powerful and one of the most beautiful verses in the Quran, and of course in this chapter as well. وَكَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُف. Right? So remember the way that the Quran works and the way that this chapter works specifically when God is telling stories. He goes into conversations, right? And he'll quote here, he'll quote there, he'll demonstrate some little sort of insight into what was happening between the prisoners and Yusuf, and between Yusuf and the king, and between the brothers amongst themselves where they were disputing what they should do to Yusuf in the very beginning. And then it cuts back to God, where the narrator now is speaking. وَكَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ يَتَبَوَّأُ مِنْهَا حَيْثُ يَشَاءُ. And that's the way that we gave power and authority to Yusuf. And we allowed for him to live in this world in the way that he pleased. Meaning that for him at this moment, he now had in his authority the entire world and all of its wealth and all of its inhabitants were subservient to him. Alayhi salatu wassalam. يَتَبَوَّأُ مِنْهَا حَيْثُ يَشَاءُ نُصِيبُ بِرَحْمَتِنَا مَنْ نَشَاءُ وَلَا نُضِيءُ أَجْرَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. He says, and that is how we made Yusuf alayhi salam in the land, that he may settle in it wherever he wished. And surely we give and we deliver our mercy to whomever we want, and we don't waste the good deeds of those who are virtuous. Yusuf alayhi salam struggles, and he perseveres, and he goes through every single thing that he goes through. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala connects all of the trials and the struggles of Yusuf to every single one of us at this moment. What does he say? He says that we, meaning Allah, has the ability to give anything to anyone, any wealth, any power, any authority, any station. Remember that. It doesn't come from anyone. All goodness, all beauty, all honor, it comes from Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَا نُذِيءُ أَجْرَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. And surely God never wastes the deeds of the good doer. Not one. We mentioned this last week as well. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will remember every single one of our good deeds. And God will undoubtedly reward us in this world and in the next for every single one of those deeds. But we have to have that sense of conviction in it. Yusuf, he knew his time was coming eventually. He knew it, which is why he patiently persevered through all of this. And he knows that God is watching him at every second. And it's hard, right? But as we're watching this and as we're seeing this, we know, many of us who have heard this story dozens of times, we know, and even for those who don't, we know that there's a happy ending, so to say, right? In this beautiful anecdote. Over here, at this moment, the authority of this massive kingdom was like a little, coin in the hand of Yusuf alayhi salam, getting thrown into the well, getting abused by his brothers, being distant from his family, getting thrown into prison, being treated as, primary villain number one in this government, living in prison, having those who were supposed to have him freed forget about him and letting him sit in that prison for 7 years. Everything that he had to go through. وَكَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ يَتَبَوَّأُ مِنْهَا حَيْثُ يَشَاءُ نُصِيبُ بِرَحْمَتِنَا مَن نَّشَاءُ وَلَا نُضِيءُ أَجْرَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ وَلَأَجْرُ الْآخِرَةِ خَيْرٌ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَكَانُوا يَتَّقُونَ. And a verse that's even more important than that. We take a look at this and we're like, oh wow, if I just patiently persevere, if I do the right thing, I can get all of these amazing benefits in this world, right? Think about it. Think about how much power and authority and wealth that Yusuf now has. Something that we could probably never dream of. I don't know how large, the empire of Egypt was back in that day. 1/3 of the world, half of the world. He has a lot of power. He is, basically been given everything and said, you run the show. That's all for Yusuf alayhi salam. Yet God reminds us of something. And certainly Yusuf wasn't thinking about it in terms of his physical authority over this dunya. وَلَأَجْرُ الْآخِرَةِ خَيْرٌ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. He says, but O believer, and O Yusuf, know that everything in the next world is far better than what you're going to get right now. The kingdom, the authority, the power, people, deifying you, whatever it might be, none of that's important if you compare it with that which you get in the next world. وَلَأَجْرُ الْآخِرَةِ خَيْرٌ. And surely the reward of the next world is better for those who believe and those who have taqwa, those who are God conscious. We can't compare. We don't understand. We have no idea what the reward of the next world is like. We've never seen it before. What can we compare it to? The only thing that we know is that which we see in this dunya. And if God tells us that everything in the next world is better than it is in this world, then even the best of the best in this dunya doesn't compare with the worst in paradise. And there's nothing bad in paradise, essentially. The example that's given oftentimes in the Quran is, like these physical, tangible, blessings that we receive in the akhirah, like fruits. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, when you enter into paradise, you will eat from its fruits. Like when you eat a fruit in the dunya, sometimes the fruit doesn't taste so good, right? As much as you want it to taste good, it doesn't necessarily taste good. It might be spoiled on the inside, whatever. But at the end of the day, the fruits in paradise, not only are they far more delicious, but they're so good that our intellects can't perceive how good they are. The only reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us examples of physical things about paradise, tells us about the fruits and the couches and the homes and all of the rivers and the gardens and so on and so forth, is because we're a human being who loves physical, tangible things. We like things, right? We like things. And so we understand incentive via things. When you get a job, you're going to ask what my salary is going to be. When you understand what your salary is going to be, you're going to think about how you can spend that money appropriately, so on and so forth. It's the nature of who we are as a human being. So God gives us glimpses into what this paradise is like and what the world beyond this one is like. But those glimpses don't tell the full story. Let me give this example. I've given this before for those of you who are here. You know, sometimes if you think about the comparison between the next world and this world, akhirah and this dunya, it's probably very similar to the comparison between this world and the world that we existed in before this dunya, which was in the womb of our mothers. We lived inside of our moms. If someone came and told you that, hey, there's a better world outside of this world that you're living in, what are we going to say? I don't believe you, right? You're lying to me. How could anything be better than what I'm living in right now? I'm next to the one who cares about me. I'm next to my sustainer. When I want food, I get fed. When I want drink, I get drink. I'm warm. I'm comfortable. All is good. Don't take me out of here, right? A child enters into this world and they scream and they cry and they wail, right? And they hate this place those first couple of days. Eventually, we figure it out, right? And it's probably better, though some days we wish that we were back in the womb of our mothers. Generally speaking, we're happy the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala moved us on from that world to this world. But if someone had explained to me, right, back in that day, when I was still a, embryo in my mom, someone said that you were going to have friends, and you're going to have community, and you're going to have donuts, and you're going to have pecan pies, and you are going to be in the company of your spouse and of your children. You're going to have so many amazing experiences during the course of your life. How would I have understood what that means? What are you talking about? The only place that I can go is either head up or head down, right? I'm just swimming here somewhere. There's no way, right, for someone to understand, what life is like in the dunya if the only thing that they saw was the stomach of their moms. Fair enough? That's exactly what life is like in this dunya. We have no idea what incredible blessings that God has reserved for us in that world is. We don't know. We don't understand. We don't have the capacity. So God tells us by these physical things, giving us some symbols. There's food, and these are gardens, and then there's rivers. But what do we know about those gardens? What do we know about those fruits, right? What do we know about all of the bounties and the blessings and the rewards of that world? But what we do know, going back to these ayat, is that whatever Yusuf had, and he had it all at this moment, right? For everything that he has to go through, he deserves it all, right? At that moment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us as well, وَلَأَجْرُ الْآخِرَةِ خَيْرٌ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَكَانُوا يَتَّقُونَ. That surely the reward for Yusuf, the reward for the believer, is far better in the world beyond this one, provided they believe and provided they have God consciousness. They believe and they see and they feel the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We'll stop over here for today. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد